We have successfully inserted an item into a new table inside of our cloud database. Now it's time to read from the table from the database so we can let the user log in or tell them that the credentials are incorrect. We are going to be reading from the user table, which already has an email and a password. And we're going to evaluate if the email that is inside of the table has a password assigned equal to the one that the user writes down on the entry. So let's change our current functionality for the login of the user to something that actually works. For that, I am going to navigate back to Visual Studio to implement this logic. Back in Visual Studio, we have already used the mobile service property that we created inside of the app class to insert something into a table. But before inserting something into a table, we got the table directly from the database. It is exactly this what we have to do to get information from the table. So what we're going to add as functionality for the login is going to be very similar to what we have in here. So I am going to close these two files that I have open inside of Visual Studio, and I want to navigate to my portable class library and open the main page.saml.cs. Here is where currently we're only evaluating if both the email entry and the password entry have something inside written down for us to allow the user to log in. But in here we have to do something different. First, we have to get the user table from the database that is in the cloud. And we have to get the entry in the table that has the same email as the one that was written down inside of the email entry. So if you think about it, we're going to need to use the where operation that we learned in the previous section we can use with LINQ. And this where operation is going to also work with a mobile service in addition to SQLite. So we can create a new variable, which is going to be user. And this user is going to be equal to what we get from the table, where that table has as an email what is written inside of the email entry. So we have to use the mobile service that is defined inside of the app class as a static, and through the mobile service, get a table. Again, we have to use the getTable method and pass the table that we want to get. In this case, user. To be able to use the user class inside of this file, we may need a using directive. We can add it. And until here, we will already have the table itself. Now, what we need is to filter this table. And for that, we can also use the where operation that comes directly from LINQ. This where operation is going to work the same way in which we used it for SQLite. We have to first establish the name of a variable, which is going to be u for user. And then with the syntax of equal and the closing angle bracket, we will be able to then enter the evaluation. So in here, I am going to evaluate if view.email, which is the email of the user, is equal to whatever is written down inside of the email entry. So with this evaluation, we're going to filter the table where the value of the email column is equal to the value that was written down by the user inside of the email entry. But still, after making this filter, the user variable is not yet of type user. What we can do is, after getting the where, is get this as a list. If you think about it, what you will always be getting when making a query to a table, even with a filter, is going to be a list. It doesn't mean that all of the time there are going to be more than one element. It just means that because there is a table, there is always a possibility of there being more than one. Now, it doesn't mean either that the user should remain a list of users. We have to get one element from this list. And so what we're going to do is get this in parentheses. And by the way, we have to await the call for the toList async and get all of the line inside of parentheses and then get the first element. We're going to use the first or default method again. So we can get the first element that is inside of the list that is being returned. And since we are using an async operation, we're going to need to set this method as async. And so the user variable is now going to be of type user. And by the way, we may need to evaluate this only when there is a value inside of both entries. So I'm going to cut this line and I'm going to paste them right before navigating to the home page. Because if you think about it, we only want to make a query to the table when we are certain that there is a value inside of the email and the password. If there is not, there is no case for why to do that. So now that we have the user, before actually navigating to the home page, we have to evaluate if what is inside of the user's password is the same to what the user wrote down inside of the password entry. So after getting the user, first I actually want to evaluate if user is different than null. And if it is, it means that there is at least one user inside of the table that has the email that was written down inside of the entry. If there is, then we can evaluate if the password is the same. So if the user's password is equal to what is written down inside of the password entry, then and only then are we going to navigate to the home page. And since we have changed this method to be async, we can await this operation now. Now, if this evaluation is false, it means that the user wrote down something that is not the correct password. We can add an else statement that is going to display an alert to the user, letting them know that the user or the password are incorrect. So it has to have a title, a message, and a cancel button. This method is also an async method, and since we are already on an async method, we can await this operation as well. And if the user is null, then we have to add another else clause, which is going to also display an alert letting the user know that there was just an error logging them in. Like this. And the functionality should be ready by now. If both the email and the password entries have something written on them, then we're going to make a query to a table inside of the mobile service. We're going to get the information from the user table where the email column has a value of the same text that the user has written down inside of the email entry. We're going to get all of that as a list, but we're not going to get the list entirely. We're going to get the first or default element inside of that list. Then we have to evaluate if the user is actually different than null. This would mean that at least one element with that email was inside of the table. If it is not null, then we can evaluate if the password that was retrieved from the database is equal to the password that was written down on the corresponding entry by the user. If it is, then we can navigate to the home page. If it isn't, we let the user know that there was an error, that the email or the password are incorrect. If the user is null, then we can assume that there was an error getting the information from the table, and we display that error to a user. So let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to run this on a simulator, it doesn't matter which one, and in the login page I will want to write exactly what I wrote down when I registered the user. Now I happen to have what I wrote down right here, even though it's quite random, and once I have written that down, let me actually add a couple of breakpoints in here. I'm going to add a breakpoint right after the user has been received, so I can evaluate what is inside of that variable. I am going to click on login, and while the query is being executed, it may take a couple of seconds before we get the information for the user. Once the breakpoint hits, we can hover over the user variable and expand the values, so we can see that we have indeed received the email, the ID, and the password. So of course this operation is going to be true because the user has some value inside. And we can move to the next line by using the controls in Visual Studio, and here evaluate if the user password is going to be equal to the same password that we have. And since it is going to be, the execution to the navigation is going to be performed. So we have now successfully read from the table inside of the cloud database for us to evaluate if the user and the password are the same. And we have executed the navigation to the home page now by evaluating these credentials instead of just evaluating if the entries are not empty. In the next lecture, we're going to learn how to insert to a table, but now we have to include the user information. So we know what posts that we're going to be now inserting into the database, into the cloud database, came from this user. So we don't display to the user posts that some other user may have inserted.